And I remember standing on a booth in Bennelong and seeing what no doubt were operatives directing in Chinese language Chinese Australians into the booths. I was gobsmacked at the brazenness of it.
Welcome to Meridian 100, a new podcast about Asia. I'm your host, Paul Maley. Scott Morrison was Australia's Prime Minister from 2018 to 2022. He was in the chair when Australia's relationship with China was at its most fraught, and, of course, he was the architect of the AUKUS agreement, a trilateral security partnership between Australia, the UK and the United States. AUKUS has both its fans and its critics, but what both agree on is that if realised, it will count as one of the most consequential security arrangements to emerge from the region in decades. Scott Morrison joined us to talk about how it came about, where it's going, and what kind of region he thinks we'll be living in as strategic competition between China and the West intensifies. And just a note, I was a senior advisor to both the Defence and Home Affairs ministers in the Morrison government as AUKUS was being negotiated. Scott Morrison, welcome to Meridian 100.
Great to be with you, Paul.
Thank you. Scott, I want to talk to you about foreign policy during your period in office. Your most high-profile achievement was the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the UK and the US. AUKUS, as we know, will see Australia furnished with 8 nuclear-powered submarines and an array of sophisticated capabilities in the form of cyber, AI, quantum and hypersonics. Can you talk to us a little bit about the history of AUKUS? How did it come about? Why was it seen as necessary? And how, if at all, did it change from conception to announcement over time?
It all began when I had very real concerns about the progress of our attack class submarine program. Now, I thought these were soluble and it had been a topic of discussion between myself and President Macron on numerous occasions, and he was highly attentive to these issues. And there were some slippages that were really starting to show. And towards the end of 2019, it became apparent that I thought, well, they're going to slip some gates here on this thing. And as a result, we need to ensure that we have a good plan B if this fails. And increasingly, as you recall, at the time, I mean, this had become already then a largely friendless project, but a very important one. If you were picking a diesel-powered submarine, then this was the submarine you would have picked. But the fact that we were experiencing such difficulties with Naval and in making this happen was a big problem. So we sort of went down 2 tracks, try and solve those problems, and we made quite a bit of progress on that front. But the other option was to go, well, if this doesn't succeed, why for once could we not have a plan B that isn't better than plan A? And the real question of Australia acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability, this was the last chance.
Do we assume from that the preference from the earliest stages was for an American-designed boat? Or
no,
was there...
not at all. Actually, preference is probably not the word. Over that period, to be fair to the Americans, we were coming to them. They weren't coming to us. And I think one of the great challenges that we were trying to address in the AUKUS partnership was not a displacement of capability from one partner to another, but an overall enhancement. We were going for the synergy outcome here. And what that meant was we wanted more in total between all 3 countries. More nuclear-powered submarines built, not the same amount, just moved around. And I noticed there's been some commentary about this. And AUKUS was designed to ensure that that wasn't the outcome. And
sorry, just clarify that. When you say it was designed, what exactly are you talking about there?
Well, the actual production of nuclear-powered submarines, and other technology for that matter. The idea wasn't that Australia would just get access to buy stuff from the other partners. Because, I mean,
it was a common industrial base. Is that what you...
Yeah, I wouldn't put it as tightly as that or formally as that. But you needed to look at the industrial defence bases platform of the entire 3 countries, and you go, we want all 3 of them to be able to produce more, not less. And, I mean, the design appropriateness of the various the SSNRs in the UK and the Virginias over in the US. Both good boats, different. I mean, Australia has arguably a longer history of engagement, interoperability, I suppose, with the UK, particularly in Navy. But the relationship with the United States is outstanding as well. So there was no preference, certainly, for a US boat at all. And there was certainly nothing being pushed by the US defence establishment for that to be the outcome. Because the discussion we were having with them was about the technology and having access to that technology, which the only other party is the United Kingdom. And so, there's a natural relationship there between Australia and the UK as well, and Boris and I have had a very good relationship. And
the UK, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
the UK boats are smaller and more manageable, and the nuclear overlay is simpler.
Yes, they are. That's not to say that the Virginia, in its most recent iteration in a design, can't similarly be in that space. And that was a later sort of event. At the time we were talking about it, though, no, you're right. At the time we were talking about it, that type of capability, it was a bigger boat, bigger crew, bigger cost, all of these sorts of things. The UK options, if you like, for our ambition was probably more digestible. But that's not to say there weren't challenges with that as well. I mean, we'd already been going down the frigate challenges and the design issues there, and no criticism of that either. But so any which way you cut this, building a nuclear-powered submarine is incredibly difficult. But no, there was no preference for one or the other. And this wasn't also a typical procurement process. This wasn't a beauty parade like it happened with, the Germans and the pardon me, and the French and the Japanese and others on the attack class, where we were going out to tender. This would be a decision that the three countries would always make together in what was in the best interest of each party individually in their national interest. But secondly, in the interests of the partnership and a bigger industrial defence capability.
What advice were you getting, to the extent that you can talk about this, but what advice were you getting about the kind of reaction that a nuclear-powered boat in Australia would get in the region, and in particular China? Were you getting the advice about how it would affect Chinese calculations and strategic activity?
Yeah, I mean, look, without going into that in a lot of detail, I mean, all of these things were obvious. I mean, you didn't have to be the chair of international studies at the US Naval College to work that out.
But to what extent, if any, was it expected to change Chinese strategic activity?
I'd say the more immediate issue was going to be the impact on the French. And that was unavoidable. You either had nuclear-powered submarine capability through what we're able to achieve through AUKUS and have an impacted relationship with the French, or you valued that over having that capability. And this idea that you could have had both is a complete nonsense. It defies any sort of genuine understanding of these issues, and those who seek to promote that, I think, just they can't be serious. But with China, look, everybody watches everybody closely, and their rate of militarisation, we all know, and in government you know even more. And so, no doubt, they would see any action by anyone, for that matter. Now, that goes down to when, the British or even the Germans would go for a sail through the South China Sea. The level of sensitivity to these things has been hyper under the Xi regime. And so, we obviously knew that Australia, because this sat within a nest of a broader strategy, which was what I've always called the strategy of alignment, and that was to build as much alignment amongst traditional Western countries and other potential partners to effectively bring some balance to the region.
Well, there's a question for you. I mean, is there a sense in which that is happening sort of organically anyway? If you look at AUKUS, if you look at the Quad, are you seeing a sort of quasi-balancing strategy taking shape anyway in response to the rise of China and China's increasingly aggressive strategic posture?
Well, yes, but not organically and not by accident. No two things have brought greater balance, and I think in a good way, for everybody in the region than AUKUS and the Quad. No two things have been noticed more and checked more the assertiveness of China in our region than those two events. How do I know? Look at the reaction of the Chinese. I mean, that bells the cat. Those two things more than anything, and because they are coming at the issue from different perspectives. I mean, Quad is a more comprehensive perspective. It's dealing with everything from development to
critical
to
tech,
aid, to tech, hopefully trade. That's a bit harder, but and the defence side of the Quad is important, but it's one of many things. And I do really, I commend particularly President Biden, for him putting that stamp on it early. But I think the previous administration had the same view.
Just getting back to AUKUS for a moment, there has been talk in recent months about potentially expanding AUKUS in time, particularly, but not exclusively, with Japan. Is that something? What's your view on that? I mean, is that something you envisaged at the time, or is that, if not, is that a welcome development, or do we need to bed it down first? What's your position on that?
I just don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. And I had the same view on Quad. The international relations community always wants to create, hyper new multilaterals every other afternoon. And I think that can be really dangerous. Let's get AUKUS and the Quad bedded down first before we start, moving things around too much. And the reason I say that is, take AUKUS. And this is not to reflect on any potential other partner. But why did I do AUKUS? Because I wanted Australia in a room with our two most trusted allies, with access at the highest possible level that we could achieve. Now, I would not support anything that would see a more lowest common denominator approach taken to the trust factor. Trust is the wrong word. To what AUKUS is and what it has access to, in order to make it larger. That would be against Australia's interests, and I actually think it would be against the regions. I mean, we have other countries, and the obvious next participant is Japan. But we all know Japan is still on their own defence journey and their own national security journey, and I think that's a positive one. I think it's going well, and I think there's a lot. I've been up in Japan since the election, and I think there's a lot of support for that in Japan. But that has to play out as well. I would say, don't rush it. Focus on the job you've got now. Its natural development will come, but I think that's some time away. And I would say the same thing about the Quad. And it was actually something we discussed at the Quad at the White House meeting I was at. And I was quite adamant about this, as was Japan, that let's just keep it amongst ourselves for now. There's nothing. I always had it envisaged that both AUKUS and the Quad would have dialogue partners, which is a different type of option. So you keep the holy of holies as it is, and that's really what I'm talking about. That's what AUKUS is, and I would never want to see that watered down for the sake of providing further access. But you can have an AUKUS trilateral, and then the next day, sort of AUKUS dialogue partners, which Japan is an obvious one, and perhaps India is, but that might prove too much of a stretch for India. And so what I learned in these relationships in the region is give everybody their space and time to associate as they want, and you'll find the commonality which enables you to engage, which is why I talked about a strategy as Prime Minister of alignment, not alliances. Alliances can be very formal. Alignments can have, as we've seen in the Indo-Pacific, exactly the same impact in bringing a balance which is necessary.
Let's talk about China for a moment.
Yeah.
You have said that the world hasn't changed, but that China has changed, that is the key variable. You were the Prime Minister from 2018 to 2022. You were in the NSC, the National Security Committee of Cabinet.
Well, pretty much from the start.
Pretty much from the start. So you've seen and tracked the changes. What changes have you seen in Chinese conduct over time, particularly, and in particular, the changes that have concerned you most? Well,
it was accretive, and we saw it right from back when we came into government. And it was Joe as treasurer, Joe Hockey as treasurer, which started to observe through the foreign investment process an emerging interest in strategic infrastructure from Chinese investment. And now, as time has gone on, I mean, it was clearly part of a strategy by the Chinese government to, the BRI was part of this process as well, and it was quite a calculated way of getting the tentacles into pretty much everything. So we saw that starting back, not that long after Xi came to power, and because we were seeing it come through FIRB. Then we saw the emergence of the more assertive approach, particularly through BRI, where we saw countries largely just being lined up to be in this. And there was a lot of money being splashed around. And there was pressure on Australia to be part of this, which we resisted. Now, that didn't go down terribly well. Now, we weren't pursuing a policy of seeking to be estranged because the Chinese themselves were setting up their own development bank, which we became part of. But it was a good discussion about where things were at that time. But even at that time when we were having that discussion, it hadn't got to the level that we subsequently saw. Now, that's when we saw what was happening with Confucius Institutes, what was happening in our education. Our education sector was highly vulnerable to Chinese government influence. There was an appreciation of the level of exposure. Now, remember, we were the same government that put together the Chinese-Australia Free Trade Agreement. So we were pursuing that. Trade with China was increasing. We were seeing a very assertive involvement in our, if you like, our social sector. By that I mean, education and the like. We were seeing it come through in the realm of interference. We were seeing what was happening in cyber.
And most recently the Pacific, of course.
Attributing, and that went to another level. There would always been, Chinese involvement in the Pacific, and it was one of our initiatives very early on to work with the Americans on Manus. We saw the foreign interference in our own parliament, our own polity, and what was happening both through fundraising and through direct political involvement. I'll never forget the Bennelong by-election. For John Alexander when he had the Section 44 issues. And I remember standing on a booth in Bennelong and seeing what no doubt were operatives directing in Chinese language Chinese Australians into the booths. I was gobsmacked at the brazenness of it. Then you add to that the very assertive approach taken by Huawei and others to involve itself in our 5G networks. And 5G is different in that this is the Internet of Things. This enables you to switch things on and off, and they were very aggressive. And so it was this thing was like a building wave. Now you then look what's happening in China. You're seeing a wolf warrior diplomacy, which sort of peaked while I was Prime Minister. Not at our provocation. They were doing it all on their own, and not just Australia. People forget this. It was happening overseas, and in some cases even worse. They'd already got into Lithuania. And so we were seeing this highly aggressive, assertive stance. I was seeing it play out in multilateral fora, particularly the United Nations. And during the pandemic, we saw this peaked in terms of what was clearly a very uncomfortable relationship with the WHO and what played out with COVID. So this just kept escalating and escalating. In China itself, they've completely changed their economic model to basically reject Deng, and the Xi approach is, back to SOEs, back to state control, centralising of that state control in Beijing, and this is a very different organisation.
You've spoken about the consequences of conflict with China. You spoke about them quite recently. I think you gave a speech at the Hudson Institute.
Yep.
You referred to the massive cost Beijing would have to bear should it launch military action to retake Taiwan. It's a perspective that's not often emphasised in the Australian discussion. Do you think that we at times have a tendency to outsize China's strength and perhaps downplay its frailties, the frailties within its system, its demographic problems, the likelihood of some sort of economic reckoning, the fact that its military is largely untested?
Yeah. Yes, is the short answer to all of those questions. And I think what we've seen between Russia and Ukraine bring that home. I mean, the broad assessment was that Russia would be able to, on paper, take Ukraine within a week. I'm not disclosing anything there. I think that's been widely reported, if not sooner than that. But there's a big difference. There's a big difference between what's on paper and what's on the ground. And when you compare Ukraine to Taiwan, I mean, just the geography, for a start, is very different. And what else is in play is even more magnified. Would Russia have done the same thing if Ukraine was in NATO? Obviously not. Obviously not. And the strategic ambiguity that sits around Taiwan for China, should they take that action in relation to the US and many others, I think is more of a pause for thought than Putin would have had with Ukraine. So the answer to that is yes. Have they rapidly militarised just in the last 10 years beyond what 20 years ago people thought was unimaginable? They have. How capable is that? How experienced are they? How able are they to fulfil their objectives? Well, let's not forget it was Xi who said that their ability, they want to be able to win wars. That was one of his stated objectives. He wants to win wars and have that capability. That doesn't mean he necessarily wants to wage them, but he does want the capability to do it. And so I think there is pause for thought from a military point of view, one. But then when you think about, it goes back to what you're saying and asking before about AUKUS and the Quad. I mean, Australia was under massive threat. And I think the view was that Australia would capitulate like so many others. And, our biggest trading relationship, and therefore we would just go along to get along. And we were determined not to, because and the Australian public were fantastic in supporting that position. And so we stood up to them, and we stood up to them across a broad range of fronts. And this really did, I think, discombobulate what the Chinese government thought about Australia and how we were acting. And yeah, we got thrown in the freezer, and for a long time.
Well, still in the freezer.
We effectively still are. Well, I mean, those sanctions are still in place. They can talk and welcome the talks, but let's not think that they've changed their spots for a second. They've changing tactics, not their strategy, and those things are often confused. So, they economically, the way we had seen traditionally more strongly aligned countries strengthen those alliances, strengthen those alignments. In terms of what China was doing, including in international and multilateral fora, in the way countries were working together. I think this did send a message to China that the world, and the Western world, for want of a better word, is not just going to sit there passively. And if you got to go back to when they started turning atolls into airports, when the West basically did nothing. And they were testing them. They just kept going further and further and further out, and nobody did anything. And as a result, they were green lighting the militarisation of the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific. And so our view as a government was someone has to say no. And we did, and probably the most common question put to me during that time, not always with a friendly tone from domestically, was, why do we have to be the ones? And my answer to that was, well, who else is going to? And we've got the most at stake if we just sit there and allow them to roll over us. So that alignment amongst countries, whether all the way around the Indo-Pacific, I think proved to be an important check.
Just on that point around the South China...
Of the consequences of you take an aggressive act within this region, then don't think it's all going to be the same.
Well, there's political pushback, but they still own those atolls effectively. But just on that
Sure.
point, just on that point, most of that militarisation activity occurred whilst the Americans were distracted by wars in the Middle East.
Correct.
In particular, the Syrian civil war and the fight against ISIS. Are you concerned now, looking at the war in Ukraine and the demand on resources, particularly things like smart munitions, that it is placing, that there is a similar, not identical, but a similar risk that the world, and particularly America, will become distracted by the war in Ukraine, which threatens to run, sadly, for some time yet, at the expense of the Pacific?
I think there is that risk, but
how likely is that risk?
And it's not a risk you can and probably should not, I'd argue, remove, because we have been equally very forward-leaning. We were the first, our government was, the new government has followed through in support for Ukraine. But what I did note, having been in the chair at that time, the withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years was incredibly painful, and others will run their commentary on how that was done. But what that did mean was that there was a new focus on the Indo-Pacific. And look, I saw this both from the Trump administration and the Biden administration, that the Indo-Pacific was the centre of the universe. And partly what I think we saw in Europe, because there were some really strong Europe reactions to what was happening with AUKUS and as well, and not just the rather blatant commercial perspective of France and what they're up to, but this idea of this strategic competition and what that meant, and the US putting their focus on what was happening in the Indo-Pacific and that becoming at the top of their level of concern. There are other parts of the world which go, well, it used to be us. It's very much in our interests to keep our allies and partners very focused on this part of the world. So I think that is an ongoing job for Australia. It was certainly one that was on the top of my list, and I spent, frankly, it was one of my most, if not my most important priority, to ensure we kept regional focus. So I'll give you a good example of that. In the Quad, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a sort of a bit of a view that every multilateral organisation should be having a statement or view on what was happening in Ukraine. Now, individually, we'd all said our own things, but differently. The US, Australia, Japan, particularly, had a very strong view on what was happening in Ukraine. India was in a different situation. But the thing about the Quad is it's about the Indo-Pacific. It's not there as a debating society on what's happening in Europe or Africa or other places. And one of the biggest, I think, concerns which were sought to be leveraged, particularly by the Chinese government in the region, was, look, they're not really interested in the Indo-Pacific. And the first opportunity they'll get, they'll be off talking about something else. And that was Ukraine. While I was there, and I believe it's still the case, the Quad didn't go there. The Quad remained focused on things in the Indo-Pacific. Individuals within the Quad relationship did what and continue to do what we're doing in Ukraine. But the reason I say that is that you need to ensure in the region, and that's why Japan and Australia and India are so important, because we keep the focus on this part of the world. The US will always have other things going on. That's the nature of them. And that is often taken advantage of by a Chinese government that seeks to have hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific. It's only focused really on one place, and that puts the US at a sort of a strategic disadvantage. And so it is important to keep that focus and to enable them to walk and chew gum at the same time. But I would say I genuinely believe that the US understand that, and they have looked at that period of time, and I think it is a bipartisan view in the US. You remember, I mean,
when you say they've looked at that period of... Sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying that they understand that the Chinese took advantage of of the situation in the Middle East circa 2014 to militarise the South China Sea, and they
without being critical of themselves, I think there's a very strong weight of opinion around that, and I think that's an understood position, without being self-critical. That the US being self-critical of any administration. Because you remember, the current administration is full of those who are in that administration, and there is quite a big difference between, I think, the Biden administration and the Obama administration when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And I do think that, Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell have done a very good job at getting that focus back on the Indo-Pacific. And, AUKUS was central to that message.
Talk to people inside government. You talk to people inside the national security establishment, and they are pessimistic. They will tell you, usually, that it is more than likely that there'll be some sort of hot conflict in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the foreign affairs people are a little bit more sanguine, but I think that's a fair representation of the view inside the National Security Committee. What's your assessment on the likelihood of conflict in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think the capacity for it is there. But I think the likelihood of it is less, for the reasons that I think that they'll be surprised to hear me say this, that the DFAT puts forward. Because there is a new form of mutually assured destruction in all of this. I mean, we have just lived through a period of time in world history through COVID where the world got shut down. And we all know what that does. I have no doubt that such a conflict would do the same. That doesn't necessarily mean it would have, nuclear elements to it. I think unlikely it probably would. The threat of it is always there. I think the risk of it is through misjudgment, miscalculation. That is, I think, the more likely path to that conflict than something which is a lot more assertive. And, what will happen over the next few years in China will be interesting, because we are already seeing the impacts of the change in their economic policies. How do you hold a country the size of China together? That has been the dilemma of anyone who's ever tried to rule it. The communists are no different. And you need an economy that creates momentum.
Well, now, it's also, sorry to interrupt you, but it's also at the core of the social contract, isn't it? I mean, prosperity in exchange for...
Well, there is. And I'm glad you raised that, because this was the contract that the Chinese government was trying to offer everybody else. Control for prosperity. And that is a deal they offer. And some countries take it, because some countries have no choice. But they learn the consequences of that and the debt diplomacy and the things that we've already seen. Now, Australia was strong enough to stand up to that. And, many Western countries are still not. Many Western countries are deluding themselves that they can have their cake and eat it when it comes to this. But that's why I went to the G7 and read out the 14 points to them and said, this is what these guys are about. Don't think they're any different, and don't think they won't end up in that same place with you at some point if we allow this to go unchecked. So the mutually assured destruction I speak of is one where supply chains completely collapse, no one can produce semiconductors, global capital stops moving around, sea lanes are shut in the South China Sea. That's just not going to hurt the countries of the region that aren't China or the United States. Is going to devastate the Chinese economy as well. And who's going to line up with them? Well, Russia, probably. Iran, maybe. North Korea, definitely. What I call the arc of autocracy. But outside of that, the world would become completely disassembled. Why do countries go to war that are against what you could perceive to be their objective interests? Because of something that motivates them beyond those things. And I suppose that is the concern that is there with the Xi regime as opposed to previous regimes.
But you think it's less than likely?
I think the balance of forces that are on this restrain but do not guarantee or absolutely protect, which is why you've got to do what you do. And so what do? You just make sure that, I believe as Australia, we imposed a cost for assertive, aggressive behaviour against a country like Australia. We imposed a cost. We paid a price for imposing that cost. I don't doubt that either. But we were one of the first countries to say no and stand up to the economic bullying and to work with other countries and align with them to ensure that that sort of behaviour had a cost. And there has to be a cost for those who seek to impose their will on other countries. And those who believe in freedom and liberty need to do that. Otherwise, well, they'll just keep turning atolls into islands.
Scott Morrison.
Sorry, islands into airports, I should say.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for joining us on Meridian 100.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be with you. Good chat.
That was Scott Morrison. I'm Paul Maley. Please join us again next week for another episode of Meridian 100.